On November 19th, 2025, paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer of the British Natural History Museum and spokesperson for the Out of East Africa regime for the last 40 years, posted a video to clarify the current state of the Out of Africa model. Taken at face value, the statements are far more damning than they first appear, because they quietly concede almost every premise that undermines the traditional Out of Africa narrative, while refusing to follow those premises to their logical conclusion. The statement acknowledges a million-year-old Eurasian lineage ancestral to Homo sapiens that lived outside Africa, and then relies on an unsupported inter-Africa event to preserve the out-of-Africa narrative while quietly dismissing contradictory evidence. The result is not a coherent explanation, but a revealing moment where the evidence points in one direction and the narrative is forcibly steered in another, exposing just how fragile the out-of-Africa story has become. In 2026, Out of Africa is no longer a theory or model, it is merely a story.
So the fact that the common ancestor may have been outside of Africa does not mean that this changes the whole pattern of a recent African origin for Homo sapiens, because on our analyses, the oldest sapiens fossil, for example this one from Jebel, Irhoud, lie in Africa, and all of the most ancient fossils of Homo sapiens in our analyses were African, apart from the Tabun mandible, which is from the adjoining area of Israel. So even if the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Sapiens and Longi lived outside of Africa, this would mean that there must have then been an inter-Africa event, followed by the evolution of Homo sapiens within Africa, and the rest of the story being the standard out-of-Africa story of Homo sapiens coming out of Africa and spreading to the rest of the world about 60,000 years ago.
The use of the Jebel Irhoud skull of Morocco as a prop, and the mention of the Taban mandible, is evidence that what used to be out of East Africa is now out of North Africa and the Middle East, or more specifically, out of the Maghreb Levant. The Maghreb being a historic term for Northwest Africa from Morocco to Algeria, and the Levant a term for the Eastern Mediterranean from Egypt to Greece. But Jebel Irhoud is not the only early modern human from Morocco. Dar es Sultan V has a striking resemblance to Irhoud, in spite of being 200,000 years younger. Even Stringer himself has noted this resemblance. Dar es Sultan also has a striking resemblance to Levantine fossils such as Skoul, Kafze, and Zutia, as noted by French scholars for decades, but totally ignored by the British out-of-Africa regime. The connection between Africa and the Levant cannot be ignored. This is the true origin for the so-called out-of-Africa population. They were not failed migrations or dead ends, they are our ancestors. The Levantine skulls are clearly ancestral to the first modern humans in Europe. Anyone with even a basic understanding of geography knows that North Africa and the Middle East are geographically and biologically connected, while North Africa is isolated from the rest of Africa. The geographic and biological divide, therefore, is not Eurasia and Africa, it is North Africa and south of the Sahara. The statement relies heavily on Jebel Irhoud as proof that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, yet it never confronts the fact that Jebel Irhoud does not fit within an equatorial African evolutionary sequence. Geographically, Jebel Irhoud sits in northwest Africa, a region biogeographically linked to the Mediterranean and the Near East, rather than to sub-Saharan Africa. Morphologically, it does not form a continuum with equatorial African fossils. Culturally and temporally, it stands alone from the rest of Africa. What is conspicuously absent from the argument is any demonstration of continuity between Jebel Irhoud and other African fossils. There is no series of transitional forms leading into it, and no clear descendants emerging from it within Africa. Instead, Irhoud appears abruptly, already possessing a mosaic of features often described as early sapiens, without a supporting local trajectory. This is not how origins usually look. It is how regional variants appear within broader systems. In fact, you must look to Europe and Asia for any ancestral fossils that bear any resemblance to Jebel Irhoud, such as the Soprano skull of Italy and Narmada of India. When Irhoud is labelled as African without qualification, this collapses multiple Africas into one. North Africa has always been a crossroads, connected repeatedly to the Levant and southern Europe. Treating it as equivalent to equatorial Africa erases these connections and artificially inflates the coherence of the African record. Once North Africa is properly situated within a Mediterranean Levantine context, Irhoud stops looking like an African ancestor and starts looking like part of a wider Western Eurasian population. This reinterpretation is reinforced by the concession that the 150,000-year-old Tarban mandible of the Levant represents an early sapiens fossil outside Africa. If Tarban is accepted but minimized as in an adjoining region, then the geographic boundary between Africa and Eurasia becomes negotiable whenever convenient. In reality, that boundary dissolves entirely when viewed through population dynamics rather than political maps. Jebel Irhoud, Tabun, Zutia, Apidima, Mislaya, School and Kafsa form a connected zone, not separate evolutionary theatres. Again, the crucial point is that Irhoud has no demonstrated relationship to equatorial African fossils. East Africa shows morphological persistence of archaic traits far later than Irhoud, while Irhoud itself shows features that do not clearly arise from East African antecedents. This inversion alone should trigger skepticism toward a simple African origin model. Instead, it is ignored. By treating Jebel Irhoud as definitive evidence for African origins, the statement assigns it a burden it cannot carry. Irhoud does not anchor Africa to sapiens origins, it exposes Africa's internal diversity and its external connections. Rather than proving that Homo sapiens evolved in equatorial Africa, Irhoud suggests that what we call early sapiens was already distributed across a North African Middle Eastern corridor long before any supposed 60,000-year expansion. The core problem being exposed is a semantic maneuver rather than a scientific one. Labeling the Levant as an adjacent area when Tabun is mentioned functions as a rhetorical escape hatch that allows Levantine fossils to be acknowledged without being allowed to count. This logic collapses on inspection. If the Levant is merely adjacent, then so is much of North Africa, which is biogeographically tied to the Levant rather than to sub-Saharan Africa. The Levant and the larger Middle East region has never been a marginal spillover zone. It is a long-term population core. Calling it adjacent is a way of shrinking its explanatory power without confronting what its fossils actually imply. Once that semantic trick is removed, the geographic and evolutionary map changes immediately. If the Levant can be admitted without destabilizing the model, then he must also explain why Levantine fossils present as fully formed Homo sapiens rather than transitional forms, and why this region repeatedly hosts early modern humans with better preservation and clearer archaeological context than Africa at comparable ages. The silence on these points suggests the goal is not synthesis or explanation, but containment. The Levant is allowed into the story only insofar as it does not threaten the conclusion. Underlying all of this is a clear asymmetry in standards. Eurasian fossils are required to form tight phylogenetic chains, or they are dismissed as side branches. African fossils, by contrast, are allowed to be isolated, discontinuous, and contradictory, yet still define the origin. East Africa preserves archaic morphologies for hundreds of thousands of years, shows very late persistence of primitive traits, and lacks a smooth transition from archaic to modern forms. That pattern looks less like a cradle and more like a sink, a region where multiple lineages arrive and mix rather than originate cleanly. What these omissions ultimately protect is a single conclusion that cannot be openly confronted. If Homo sapiens emerges as a recognizable population outside sub-Saharan Africa, then out of Africa ceases to be an origin model and becomes merely a slogan. By downgrading the Levant to adjacent, overloading Jebel Irhoud with interpretive weight it cannot bear, and refusing to treat the Levantine evidence with the same logic, the narrative is preserved at the cost of coherence. That tension is now exposed, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. However, previous statements from Dr. Stringer are much less constrained and more revealing. He explicitly raised the possibility the first Homo sapiens lived in Western Asia rather than Africa. That is not a minor adjustment. It directly undermines the logic of an Africa-exclusive origin. The contradiction becomes sharper when he speculated that there may be million-year-old Homo sapiens fossils still undiscovered, or 300,000-year proto-Homo sapiens in the Levant. That claim is impossible to reconcile with the idea that Homo sapiens evolved only after a late into-Africa event, and then left again 60,000 years ago. If Homo sapiens, or something recognizably ancestral to sapiens, existed around 1 million years ago, then Africa cannot be the sole or even primary birthplace in the traditional sense. At best it becomes one region within a much older, much broader evolutionary system. However, the most destabilizing element of the statement is not the mention of Jebel Irhoud, nor the familiar reassurance about a recent African origin, but the admission that the Yungian 2 fossil from China, dated to roughly 1 million years ago, belongs to a lineage connecting Homo longi, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. This single sentence detonates the traditional framework more thoroughly than what Out of Africa is willing to admit. In this light, the long-standing idea that Eurasia was merely a recipient of African dispersals collapses. Instead, Eurasia becomes a place where a deep, coherent lineage was already established, diversified and persistent across enormous geographic distances. What makes this especially consequential is the temporal depth involved. 1 million years is not a marginal adjustment to the timeline. It is a foundational reordering. Once that premise is accepted, the conventional role assigned to Africa as a late, isolated cradle becomes untenable. What the geographic logic briefly acknowledges but does not pursue is decisive. Homo antecessor in Spain and Yungian-related fossils in China bracket the entire continent. These are not marginal or peripheral occurrences. They are opposite ends of the old world, connected by a shared lineage. That configuration is incompatible with a model in which Eurasia is merely seeded by repeated African exits. Instead, it implies a long-lived Eurasian metapopulation capable of generating multiple descendant lineages. At this point, the intellectual trajectory should be clear. If Eurasia hosts a million-year-old lineage ancestral to later humans, then Africa can no longer be the exclusive engine of modern human origins. Africa becomes one region within a larger system, not the singular source. Yet rather than following this implication, the statement abruptly pivots away from it. The discovery is framed as radical only up to the moment where it threatens the established Out of Africa narrative. After that, interpretive breaks are applied. What makes Yungian so disruptive is that it is not a speculative fossil nor an ambiguous fragment, but a reconstructed specimen integrated into a formal phylogenetic analysis. Stringer cannot dismiss it as an anomaly without undercutting his own work. Instead, he acknowledges its implications and then immediately neutralizes them by asserting continuity with a model that the fossil itself contradicts. This tension is not resolved, it is merely managed. In reality, this forces a reconsideration of where origins even reside as a concept. If the deep ancestry of Homo sapiens lies within a Eurasian-wide lineage that already existed 1 million years ago, then later, African fossils cannot be treated as the starting point of humanity. They can only represent regional developments within a much older, much broader evolutionary story. Yungian changes everything precisely because it removes Africa's monopoly on ancestry, while leaving no logical pathway to restore it without introducing unsupported inter-Africa events. Having conceded that the common ancestor of Homo sapiens lived outside Africa, the statement attempts to preserve the traditional model by introducing an into-Africa event. This is not derived from evidence. It is introduced as a narrative necessity. The logic is circular. Because Homo sapiens must have evolved in Africa, any external ancestry must be followed by a return migration. The into-Africa event exists solely to protect the conclusion and has never been described in any scientific study. What is most striking is that this proposed migration has never been specified in time, archaeological signature, or mechanism. It is a ghost event, invoked only when needed and otherwise ignored. No fossils documenting this supposed influx into equatorial Africa are identified. No technological evidence is described. No ecological or demographic pressures are outlined that would explain why a Eurasian-derived population would retreat southward into environments already occupied by long-established hominins. From a biogeographic standpoint, the Into-Africa migration borders on absurdity. Africa during the Middle Pleistocene was not an empty stage awaiting a returning cast. It was densely inhabited by archaic populations with deep histories. To suggest that an incoming Eurasian population not only entered this region, but then entirely redefined the species without leaving a clear fossil or archaeological trail, is to ask for a suspension of disbelief rarely demanded elsewhere in paleoanthropology. The insistence on a return into Africa reflects a desire to keep sub-Saharan Africa at the center of the story, not an inference drawn from the evidence. The asymmetry becomes even more apparent when compared to how Eurasian fossils are treated. Eurasian lineages must justify their existence through continuity, morphology, and phylogenetic coherence. African fossils, by contrast, are allowed to define origins even when they are isolated, contradictory, or lacking clear ancestry. The Into-Africa hypothesis exploits this double standard by relocating the decisive evolutionary phase into a region where discontinuity is tolerated rather than explained. Conceptually, the move also undermines the very meaning of origin. If the common ancestor is Eurasian, and if Homo sapiens emerges only after a return migration, then Africa is no longer the place where humanity begins, but the place where one branch is finalized. That is not an origin story, it is a regional specialization narrative. Calling it recent African origin becomes a semantic maneuver rather than a scientific description. In practice, the Into-Africa event functions as an invisible bridge over a chasm the model cannot cross. It connects incompatible premises without addressing the gap between them. It is not that the event is implausible in principle, it is that it is invoked without evidence, without constraints, and without consequences. In any other context, such an ad hoc solution would be recognized as pseudoscience. Here, it is treated as a reasonable adjustment only because it preserves a familiar conclusion. The final pillar of the statement is the claim that Homo sapiens sapiens spread out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, referred to as the standard out-of-Africa story. This story has achieved near-mythical status. Yet what the data actually record is not an expansion from equatorial Africa, but a severe reduction in Eurasian Homo sapiens populations 75,000 years ago, followed by re-expansion. When viewed in this light, the 60,000-year signal is not evidence of first presence. Earlier Homo sapiens populations outside Africa are well documented in the Levant and Asia well before this date, yet they are systematically framed as failed dispersals. This framing assumes what it seeks to prove, that the later expansion is the true origin. In reality, it may simply be the last expansion to leave a strong genetic footprint. The Toba eruption. 75,000 years ago provides a far more parsimonious explanation. It would have devastated Eurasian populations, erasing much of the genetic diversity accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. Africa, less affected climatically, would retain deeper lineages. When conditions stabilized, populations expanding from refugia would appear genetically young, even if their ancestors had occupied those regions long before. Thus, the 60,000-year event is an artifact of preservation bias, not a historical reset. It marks the point at which surviving populations recolonized emptied landscapes, not the moment Homo sapiens first left Africa. Treating it as an origin event confuses demographic recovery with evolutionary birth. This is why Out of Africa has not wanted to push back the event beyond 70,000 years, because then the overlap with Toba is unavoidable. When Out of Africa was only 40,000 or 50,000 years ago, Toba could be dismissed, but now that Out of Africa is pushed back to 70,000 years ago, it can no longer be ignored. Once the North African and Levantine fossils are taken seriously, the East African story collapses. Human history becomes one of repeated contractions and expansions within a connected Afro-Eurasian system, not a single heroic exit from an African homeland. The Into Africa event exists only to rescue a predetermined conclusion. Jebel Irhoud undermines the idea of equatorial Africa as the cradle of Homo sapiens, and the 60,000-year expansion reflects repopulation, not origin. So Out of Africa is now just a story, and not a scientific hypothesis. Taken together, these points do not merely challenge the traditional story. They reveal that it is being held together by rhetorical patches rather than scientific evidence. Once those patches are removed, a far older, more complex and more beautiful human history comes into view, one that no longer belongs to a single continent. Thanks for watching.